Hi, everybody. You are listening to Judging Meghan with your host, Meghan Judge. So my eighth grade graduate had a little party at the end of the year for all the other eighth graders. And it was obvious it wasn't at my house. So I'm making it sound like it was at my house. But what I loved about this was I think it was an example of how we have hope as a society. I'm going deep really soon, Dr. Fong. So I just want you to know that we're going to start deep and then you can pipe in if you want before I introduce you. Um, they're middle school kids. Middle school kids are not easy. They have all kinds of like the cool group, the kind of cool group, the mean girls, the mean boys, the whatever the groups are. And they had the graduation, and I asked my husband because he took her to this party afterwards how it went. And I'm always nervous to know how things go because, this is my oldest child. She's 14, going off to parties now, going into high school. And he said that all of the eighth graders were crying. Like all of them were crying and embracing each other. She would probably kill me for putting this on a podcast right now. Like all the groups, like it didn't matter if you were like a jock, if you were in the cool group, if, there was one girl my daughter's always had issues with. And my husband said they hugged each other and they were crying. And I just honestly, like in light of all of the stuff this makes me emotional. Here we go. In light of what's going on in our world right now, I just feel like that is the core of humanity. Like I've talked about this before, and I don't love to get political, but as we get closer to the election, it makes me nervous. But I will say this, at the core of who we are as human beings, always remember that reminder of these young kids that are learning from us, but they still have this innocence in them that they're going to be like hugging each other and crying because they're going off to the next chapter in life. I thought about it for an entire day later, when I talk about it, it makes me emotional, but it gives me hope in these kids. It gives me hope in people. Do you want to pipe in?
That's amazing. And like, how do the kids respond to that? Because number one, there should be crying, and crying is we need more of that. If you laugh, that's a good day. If you cry, that's a good day. If you get sad, that's a good day. That's just a day. And I think one of the biggest problems in 2024 is we don't accept the fact that we're supposed to have a wide range of emotions. There's no shame in crying. There's shame, I think, in not talking about what it means. When our sons graduated from fifth grade, they were crying. I was crying, and I remember like, oh my gosh, what do we do? What do we do with these emotions we're feeling right now? And that I think is super important because too often, especially with young people, we tell them, don't feel this way or don't feel bad. And if you feel bad, that's not tolerable. Like, make sure you don't feel negative. We have to feel negative. Part of the reason why we have so much issues with mental health is that we don't teach young people how to deal with those powerful feelings. So your daughters and their friends, what do they do with the crying? Do they try and shake it off? Do they try and hide it? Do they just enjoy it and take what the moment
And
is?
just like be with it. I don't know. It just gave me so much hope because there's so much negativity out there, And I will say this that
Yeah.
we're in June now. So June is Men's Mental Health Month. And I feel like there's a lot of different months. Like there's mental health. May was, me-
Everyone's
everyone
got a
has a
month,
month.
and since
Yeah.
everyone's got a month, and if we only June are men going to talk about mental health. The rest of the 11 months,
Yeah.
we're not. We're just going to do stiff upper lip and just shake it off and grunt. That's what we're going to do. But for June, we're
We're
going
going
to
to
bear it
talk
all.
about it. Yeah. But I do want to say that because I am going to be doing episodes about men's mental health. I love when I have men come on. You're a doctor, so you specialize in this, but I just think we have such a crisis in our country. Suicide is at the highest rate it's ever been, especially for young people. But that story I wanted to start with because it really kind of gave me a little bit of hope, and I thought it was a pretty special story. We've all been put here for a reason, and we all deserve acceptance.
Judging Meghan with Meghan Judge.
I'm a trauma survivor from a really young age, and I have been diagnosed with complex PTSD in the past few years. I've been surrounded by death and abuse much of my life. I've been dragged through the mud and have been to the point of not wanting to go on anymore. Through my interviews with other survivors, I've learned that there is a way out. From recovering to surviving and thriving, we all have the strength to come out the other side.
You are listening to Judging Meghan.
I'm going to be introducing Dr. Timothy Fong. Dr. Fong is a professor of psychiatry, and he is the co-director of the UCLA Gambling Studies Program. The purpose of this program is to examine the underlying causes and clinical characteristics of a gambling disorder in order to develop effective evidence-based treatment. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. I'm thrilled. I talked to you briefly. Our friend Denise introduced us, who runs Milestone Rant. She sent me the best guests in the past, and I just love Denise Klein. And so she introduced us. And I I've done an episode with pretty recently with a gambling addict. But I think it's important. I do a lot of episodes about like alcoholism, drug addiction, sobriety, that kind of stuff. But any kind of addiction, like whether it be shopping, whether it be gambling, whether it be, any kind of addiction, it all roots from a place. So can you start with that piece right there? Like, why does this happen? I mean, that's like the most easy question to start with, but I just want to know where this is all rooted.
It is not an easy answer, but it is a fundamental question. I'll start with I'm trained as a physician. I'm trained as a addiction psychiatrist. So we look at things differently than say psychologists or social workers or teachers. We look at it through the lens of medicine, biological, psychological, social risk factors that cause mental health conditions. If I say the same thing, what causes cancer? What causes diabetes? What causes dementia? We're going to have a wide ranging area of things that cause it. For me, addiction is a brain disease. I first learned that in 1995. And we're only talking about 30 years of the medical field saying that, okay, the reason why men and women continue to engage in harmful consequences despite harmful consequences is because it's a brain disease, meaning there are changes in the brain structure, in the brain function, how it reacts, how it adapts, how it just exists. So if I say to you, what are the signs and symptoms of heart disease? Chest pain, shortness of breath, swelling of the legs, right? Not able to walk up a flight of stairs without, fainting, blood pressure ups and downs. We can measure all of that. Well, addiction is similar. That we have the signs and symptoms of addiction. It's the craving for behavior or substance. It's the inability to stop. It's the withdrawal symptoms. It's the tolerance. But if fundamentally put it all in, I think why it's so hard with addiction, it's still ultimately harder to measure than, say, heart disease. And when it comes to an addiction like gambling, where there are no drugs being ingested into the body, it's even harder. Because again, what do quote men and women with gambling addiction look like? Well, they look like me and you. They walk, they talk, they put their pants on, they put their makeup on, they sound great, they look healthy, but inside their brains are changes. Inside their brains are different ways of the way they look at money, the way they look at reward, the way they look at games, to the point where they create the sign and symptom of this addiction where they continue to engage despite harmful consequences. So the long answer is that, but the simple answer is this: addiction at its core is a biological, psychological, social condition, which means you have to have those three areas of risk factors to generate the actual condition. So anyway, we'll start with that, but that's kind of how I always like to introduce
But
that topic.
what I'm wondering is, So a lot of times addiction it's a hereditary, and correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not the doctor, nor do I claim to be one. And if I was, that would be slightly terrifying because I was like a solid, I think I graduated college with a solid like 2.8 and look at me now. Um, but what I want to focus on is why for like gambling or shopping or alcohol or any of this stuff, a lot of it can be hereditary, right? So it's some kind of gene,
Right.
but a lot of
Yes.
it is based off of trauma stemming from childhood. So like,
It can be.
okay, so like for like a gambling addiction, for example, could that stem from childhood trauma?
Oh,
Okay.
absolutely. And so when we fold it all into the biological risk factors for any addiction, and even gambling addiction, number one, are going to be family history, genetic history. So there's actually, you're just born that way. So you're born to respond to gambling cues and money in totally different ways. You know, example, I've had patients who say the very first time they placed a bet, that's the first time in their life they felt alive or they felt normal or they felt just thrill and excitement, like that roller coaster going down feeling. Another biological risk factor is going to be certain medications. If you're on certain medications that cause you to gamble more and cause you not to be able to handle risk. So those are biological risk factors. Head injuries is a risk factor. Psychological risk factors, untreated depression, untreated trauma, certain personality traits, someone who's impulsive, someone who doesn't deal with loss very well, someone who's very competitive, someone who avoid stress by wanting to isolate into a game. These are psychological risk factors. And then ultimately, social risk factors, availability, access to money, the culture that drives gambling behavior, saying it's okay. So again, a lot of times people focus a lot on trauma, 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 and you know, there's a lot of things that we define as trauma. I view it as, yeah, there are a lot of unfortunately really horrible stuff that happened to people's lives, and in combination with their genetic risk factors, in combination with their culture, in combination with access to whatever they have on hand, that's what how trauma leads to addiction. So when I was in medical school, I learned very simply, you know, people use drugs or gamble for two reasons: to feel high or to feel normal. And if you imagine if trauma is impacting your life so much that you can't sleep, you can't eat, you don't feel safe anywhere, then suddenly you find a substance or an activity, shopping, gambling, sex, retail therapy, whatever, exercise, that makes you feel high or feel normal. Of course, the body is going to respond and go back to that over and over. I think oftentimes every patient I see, this story, how they developed a disorder, how they got into difficulty with addiction is so different. It's never the same. And I think that's why addiction and mental health is so fascinating. Because you can have some people that have all these risk factors, biological, psychological, social, and they never develop the condition. Then you have others that on paper, you're like, why would they develop an addiction when they don't have any of those things and that they developed it anyway? So these are just guideposts. These are our best educated guesses as to try and predict human future. And by definition, that's something we always want to do, but we can't always. And I think that's dangerous in some ways to try and project. Oh my gosh, this person absolutely destined to go end up being a gambling disorder versus others. It just doesn't always work that way. And I think trauma really, really highlights that. It's not just having bad things happen to you, it's having bad things happen to you in combination with the way your body was made and the people around you, your quote support or lack thereof that then lead you to do these other activities.
Don't you think, and this is just into a deep area, but the brain is so fascinating to me. I think that's why I'm so drawn, and that's why I do this,
Yeah.
because it's not like the heart. It's not like, having an injury in your leg where you need, or like your hip where you need a hip replacement. You can
Yeah.
understand all of those organs and how they work and like what you need to do. Whereas like you
Right.
kind of just touched on somebody, it's not like a one size fits all. So with the brain,
Right.
whether any kind of addiction that somebody has, it's a not a one size fits all. So like one medication isn't going to work for one person, but it might work for somebody else. And so
That's right. And
yeah,
vice versa. Same thing, like psychotherapy might work really great for somebody, but for someone else, it might actually make them worse, or the different type of psychotherapy that they get. Same thing with social treatments like Gamblers Anonymous or 12 Steps. Some folks really do incredibly well with that in recovery. For others, they can't find safety or connection in that group experience. They have to find it through something else. But absolutely, and that's the thing is our brains are incredibly plastic. So you think about like Play-Doh or kinetic sand, right? That's something that all the kids use, and it's moldable, it's flexible, it stiffens in the sun, and then you can get it back in little ways. It's really fascinating that way, and I think instead of us focusing on all the horrible things that are going on and all the horrible tragedies that people go through, is I recognize that no matter how horrible things get, the brain can still recover very, very, very well to the point where people can enjoy their lives again. And I think that's the surprising thing. And I get that a lot where people are like, hey, how do you work in this field? How do you work in the addiction and the mental health space? And don't you just get burned out by hearing stories of tragedy and isolation and financial desperation and crime and lethal emotional pain and emotional suffering? And I'm like, no, because on the back end of it, people come out of it and they do incredibly well. And yeah, lots of people do poorly, but lots of other people a year later or 5 years later, you wouldn't believe how the kind of thing that they can do. And all of that, brain recovery, mind recovery, body recovery. That's how I think about it.
can I go backwards a little bit? Because I didn't talk enough about you in the beginning, and I would like to give you your due time. I hope that you're good with that. I want to know specifically why you decided to go, like what your background is, why you decided to go into this field. Because it sounds like you really enjoy what you do and love what you do. And I think that's great.
You have to
Yeah.
just like
Yeah.
you do. I mean, well, I tell a lot of medical students, and I even tell our kids, you don't want a job, you want a career. You want something that you don't define yourself by, but you get to define what you do. So, I'll start. Look, I'm Generation X, so I grew up, you know, um, in the '80s, listening to a lot of '80s music and watching all sorts of movies and wrestling and growing up in a very, very good part of the suburbs of Chicago. So lots of friends, strong family, technology coming into play, all sorts of interesting things. And when I went to college at Northwestern, I was fascinated at all sorts of things, just curious about science, curious about humanities, and I ended up doing a biology and English major, 1990 to 94. That kind of set the tone to go into mental health, right? That interplay between neuroscience and humanities, and I was always fascinated in with the English side. We try to understand people's motivation and why they did things in books and novels. That set the tone for psychiatry, and so I went to medical school with the idea that I wanted to do something in allergy or rheumatology or dermatology or sports medicine. But the year was 1995, and I went to the Betty Ford Center in Palm Springs on a travel scholarship, knowing nothing about addiction, knowing nothing about mental health. And I spent a week there, and it really changed my life. And that I was embedded with the clients going through the residential treatment. I spent all day with them, and I just couldn't understand how these incredibly intelligent and amazing humans couldn't say no. Remember, I grew up in the '80s where it was just say no. It was, "This is your brain on
Hello, I
drugs."
did too. I remember it. Nancy Reagan. Yeah,
Right,
I
remember that?
remember the commercials.
Frying
Yeah.
pan, just
Yeah.
say no, dare, all that kinda, like, scared straight kinda
Mhm.
stuff. And if you used drugs, that you were a loser and stupid. And then, we're actually on the anniversary when the basketball player Len Bias died, and that really shocked everyone to the core of what drugs can do. But contrast that with what I was seeing in 1995, which were these incredibly smart people who were like, if I could just say no, I wouldn't be here in the drug rehab program. And that got me fascinated in the try to understand what was going on in people's body, brains, and minds. So that's how I got into the addiction world in the mid 90s. And then gambling came about when the rise of gambling in America right after the 2000s, right? Think about the poker boom, internet gambling, the rise of Vegas, the rise of now sports betting, in fantasy sports, gambling becoming part of our entertainment culture. Whereas 30, 40 years ago, gambling was viewed only as criminal mob, backroom stuff, men only, cigars, very toxic masculinity kind of stuff, right? And now, after 2000, becoming gambling is a part of American culture to the point where we were seeing things like selling poker chips in Hallmark, classrooms filling out NCAA brackets, President Obama filling out an NCAA bracket, fantasy sports being talked about everywhere, poker being played in people's homes. So you fast forward that, it became very clear to me that as a addiction psychiatrist in 2002, that this was going to be an area of interest. And there was not a lot of science and research done on gambling at that point. Most of our science and research was on alcohol and cocaine and amphetamine. So you put that all together, it's kind of a different lane that a lot of folks went to. I'm not in recovery. I do have a history of gambling addiction in the family. I do enjoy gambling, and that was a big part of my entertainment structure growing up, and it still is to a certain degree. But now, when I look at it, we're talking about a very different world in 2024 than the one I grew up in the 80s and the one you grew up in there as well. We're talking about, think about the eighth graders that just graduated, right? They're growing up in a world where they look up, they see gambling everywhere. They expect gambling as part of kind of sports. They hear about their brothers and sisters and mom and dad talk about it. They see billboards and ads constantly. And then when they get to high school, they're going to hear all about older folks gambling and saying, "Hey, this is the way I made money," and all this on technology. So it's a really different world. But all the more reason, the simplistic reason, and this is why I say to med students, "Why did you get into it?" Because it didn't feel like work, and it really was incredibly a privilege to be able to go into a area of study that is just fascinating on the biological, the psychological, the social, and ultimately incredibly rewarding to work with patients and families who are hurting. And then through working with them, that hurt is a lot less. I mean, that's just really, really fulfilling.
It's also got to be, I mean, when you just touched on all of that, it's so true. Everything is centered now around, like everything. People are betting on everything. They're betting on the Super Bowl. They're betting on like the whatever that the basketball brackets, all of that stuff. It's interesting you brought up Len bias. So my dad growing up, I remember that I was little when that happened, and my dad passed away when I was a kid. But when that and it's so weird that you brought that up because it's always something I've remembered throughout my whole life because my dad knew Len bias.
Mhm.
My dad, growing up in DC, I don't remember how he knew him, but my dad was in that sports world and somehow was affiliated with him at some point. And he
Hmm.
said when he died, he said, "Megan, don't ever have premarital sex. Don't ever, what was that? Don't ever smoke cigarettes and don't ever do
Okay.
cocaine." And so it's like
Okay.
something that always stuck out in my mind for like my entire college like year. I was always like, okay, don't smoke cigarettes, don't do this, don't do that. Like it was like one of those things that was drilled in my head because I remember that perfectly, that moment
Yeah.
that was all over TV that day. But I
Yeah.
had to say that, and I'm sorry to bring that story back, but I thought it was interesting you brought that up, like kind of full circle. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the betting thing is so true. You think about like the Rat Pack and like old Vegas. And now, I mean, I love Vegas. It's a different place. It's,
Right.
Lady Gaga, all these artists now, when we were kids or younger, it was like Vegas was kind of, I don't know, like seedy. Like I just kind of remember it being like a place where you're like, what? You're going to Vegas? And then I probably went for the first time in college. And then I found the slot machines. And then I was like, oh my God, I can like win. And I know for a fact that I have something in my brain. I have that addiction piece of my brain So I told you when we
Yeah.
first talked, I struggle with uh, shopping. Like I love to shop. I just it's my thing. It brings me peace,
Yeah.
and I worry sometimes that I'm like, okay, like this is could get bad, and I'm constantly in trouble, and with my husband and all that stuff. But the gambling piece is so scary now because it's just evolving into this giant like snowball almost, where they're
Right.
saying like
Right.
like the alcohol commercials, for example. It's cool. Everybody's pretty in the alcohol commercials. Everyone's having fun. They're all drinking. It's turning into the same snowball effect with like, I'm using Vegas as an example because that's where we think of for gambling.
Yeah.
But at the
Mhm.
root of all
Mhm.
of it, if you think about it, is this great sadness of being in like that casino at the end of the night. And like,
Yeah.
I've been out like probably not for years and years, but when you see those people at the slots or gambling and it's like they're wasted and it's 5 in the morning and they can't go back to their room. Can you touch on that? I was
Yeah.
that was a long winded little deal.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's super cool, and imagine what that's like because for some folks who stay up all night at 5 o'clock in the morning, they've had a great night, they feel amazing, they're like, "That was awesome, I love that." So there's a lot of, like, false perceptions. I think, number 1, gambling is part of the human condition. We all need it, It's like, well, people are, "What are you talking about?" Well, you go back to how we defined it. It's putting something of value on an event of uncertain outcome in the hopes of winning a reward. So that could be money, but it could be time. We traditionally think of the gambling as, games of chance where we put money down in hopes of winning more money. But it's other things like, should I be a bio major or an English major? Do I date John or I date James? Do I do a podcast or do I go work at the
That's
PTA?
never
Do I
happening.
take the
That's
10 or
never
the 12?
happening, Dr. Fong. I'm never working for the PTA. Let's get real.
Never.
Do I be a no,
Well, if you wanted
no,
to be on the
let's be real.
Yeah,
Do I be a lounge
yeah,
singer or do I do a podcast? I'm doing a podcast.
right.
Go on.
Well, do I buy the Louis Vuitton or do I buy the Kate Spade bag,
Yeah.
I mean, look, and those are just different forms of gambling. So we all need this, and we all love in our lives, and we need in our lives risk, competition, excitement, anxiety, fear, community. That's all kind of what gambling can do. I think, though, people then say, well, wait a minute. So it's not a vice, it's not a sin. But why does it need to be regulated like alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis, right? Well, it's because, there's this risk from this behavior. By definition, you could potentially lose lots and lots of money. By definition, if you play games that are rigged against you, that's not fair for you as a consumer. So we regulate all forms of entertainment, right? Movies, radio, all that sorts of things, but ultimately, we still need to regulate gambling for that very reason because there is a inherent harm to it that could hurt people if they're not participating greatly. But my principles are the following. Number one, it's a form of entertainment, but it's a expensive form of entertainment that people are okay paying a lot for. So if I said, "Hey, let's go see a movie," but it's going to cost us $500 to see that movie, chances are you and I don't do that, right? But if I say $500, you and I, and we're going to see Taylor Swift, you're going to be like, that's a deal. Let's do it. So there's a weird value that's attached to like what we think is worthy of entertainment. When it comes to gambling, that number is so widely variable. For some people, they'll say, oh my God, $500 is too much to spend. That's too much. Others will say, that's just getting started. So, of all the things in America, gambling is almost like inflation proof, right? Because you can still bet $1, $2, $5. And it's not like the cost of gambling has gone up. It's just that people are willing to gamble more and people have more credit to do it. So the real question is our brains and our minds aren't evolving that fast. It's not like in the last 10 or 20 years, our brains are physically different than they were like 1,000 years ago, right? But what is changing is the environment. And so now the environment that I grew up in the 80s, if you and I were 21 and we were in the suburbs of Chicago and I said, let's gamble. There literally was nowhere to gamble legally. The lottery, that's it. and then maybe an illegal bookie that you and I would have to know someone who knew someone who had like a illegal bookie site. Very rare. But now, if you and I are high school students in 38 states or more right now, in your bedroom right now, you and I could whip open our phones and have access to literally an infinite number of gambling opportunities: slots, poker, sports betting, keno, all sorts of things you could possibly imagine. Table tennis in Taiwan. We could bet on various things. We could bet on the election. There's that sort of thing. We could bet on Bridgerton. We could bet on The Bachelorette. So, in other words, we've changed the world so much so that actual forms of betting, ways of betting with real money are so much faster than they ever were. There was did you see this news piece a couple weeks ago about how a Dave and Buster's was looking into the idea of using an app that customers inside of Dave and Buster could use to bet against each other when they're playing games. So let's say you and I go out. You're shaking your head. You're like, you go and
Mhm.
let's go out, and then we do a pop a shot, and then we'll put $20 on who wins that through this gambling app. That's just another form of gambling. So even our own institutions that for years were insulated from gambling are now starting to think about embedding gambling. It's just a matter of time before we see that in other things: TV watching, movie watching, shopping, you name it. And even I would argue some of these like online shopping things like eBay and Dollar Dash and some of these other ones are very much like gambling, right? Where you put an auction up, you put your money out, you hope you win it. And as you win it, you get the thing. If you don't, you lose your bid, that sort of thing. There's just different ways of gambling. So the real fundamental question is, what is this going to do to our society 10, 15 years from now? Are we going to be a happier, tighter, more serene society because of things like this? Or are we going to have more, friction, more pain, more split families, more, just division because of stuff like this? And I think that's why your podcast does a lot of these questions, because the real question, and I think about your daughter as a perfect example. That is exactly the type of audience that a lot of the gambling industry is going to say, we need to figure out how to reach that audience. Young, female, technologically savvy. Maybe they're not interested in sports betting yet, but we sure as heck know that they're interested in getting money. They're interested in other things. And what else could we bring to them that might get them interested in our products? So that's the sort of thing that 20 years ago, the idea of any teenage girl gambling would have been like, what? Really? Almost like a unicorn, right? Now, when you look at the gambling ads and the way they talk about it, it's really much more gender neutral. It's really meant for anyone. It's really meant that anyone, including women, should be doing this. And that if you're not, you're missing out on opportunities to make money.
Well, the
So,
piece of it that's so terrifying, like you just touched on too, is like with the evolution of like AI and the cell phone and like TikTok and constantly like I'm my younger daughter's 10. We are not allowing her to get a cell phone or TikTok or any of that until,
right.
because I've learned sadly the hard way with my 14-year-old, and I watched her change
Hmm.
from all of this. I've done
Yeah.
episodes about this, like the horrific changes from all of this stuff. But like, I think what you're talking about is like TikTok and all of these things going after our kids, through like
Yeah.
what, however it might work. That's really, really scary.
Well, let's use a different word other than
Okay.
scary, because uh, it's an opportunity, and we've created a world with technology that we don't really know what it does to the human brain, particularly the developing brain. And I think when you phrase it that way, it's like a substance. When you ingest alcohol, when you ingest, you know, food or cocaine, we know what it does to the brain. When you're ingesting social media, when you're ingesting stuff you see from the phone, that is a changes the brain. That does get into the brain. It's the same thing. It's like, going to school, when you learn calculus, that changes how your brain grows, right? So it makes sense that social media would alter human development. So what we don't know exactly is what does that do 10, 15 years down the road? Because look, we're only talking from what 2007, 2010, like 13 years that we've had this stuff. Where I look at it, when you combine the technology of the phone with gambling options, that's what's accelerated so quickly. And that experience, the young person experiencing that, it does alter their brain. It does, because the brain's so plastic, it does change it. So I agree with you. The idea is that we want to keep things like gambling away from the young people until their brains have firmed up, until their brains have grown to all the neurons and that they can deal with wins and losses. As an example, so many of the young people I see, I say, why'd you get into gambling? Well, I thought it was a reliable way of making money. I said, what's a reliable way of making money is getting a job. And then a lot of young people say, but why would I do that? And it's fascinating, right? And I say, well, why wouldn't you want to work, make $16 an hour, learn a life skill, meet people, get out of your parents' hair? Wouldn't that be something you would want? And then many of them are like, no. And that's where two things have happened. COVID impacted people's desire to go out. But I hear a lot of the young people saying, why should I work for 15 bucks an hour when I can make 500 in 10 seconds? And I'm like, that's not likely. So you see, there's a weird gap here where we have to go back and say, yes, there's a lot of digital technology impacting human brain development, but we also have cultural values that impact decisions on whether or not people want to use digital technology or not. So one of the things we said to our oldest son is you're going to work, you're going to play a music instrument, you're going to play sports, and you're going to do some civic minded adulting things like learning how to cook, learning how to drive and getting a driver's license, and learning how to ride the train by yourself. So that recipe for us, just for us, worked. He didn't develop any sort of mental health issues. He got into UCLA. Things are pretty good right now. But my point, and I'm wondering, is exactly what you're highlighting, is that we should be thinking about any technology through the phone that reaches our brain as an opportunity to understand, is this helping us or is it potentially hurting us? I think we are now reaching a clear that no, social media is hurting people in any shape or form, particularly at a younger age. Gambling at a younger age, absolutely, there's no doubt in my mind, is going to hurt brain development, particularly if they're doing it frequently, if they're doing it without being educated about the risks, if they're doing it underneath, and if they're doing it with these false views of what it is. So the young people that are seeing the ads of people making tons of money, seeing the ads of people running around having tons of fun, hearing these magic mythical stories of Johnny's friend who had a cousin from Niagara Falls who won $5,000 or $50,000 off one bet. That kind of mythology, right? All that gets into the brain of young people saying, why can't that be me? Of all the things I think about digital technology, it's the great equalizer, right? It's now brought everything in front of one people when in fact in years past it couldn't. So in other words, if I wanted to gamble years ago and I didn't have a car, I couldn't get there. You had to have a car and friends and all of that. Now, because it's so accessible, it's become the great equalizer in terms of that it's made it equitable for anyone to be able to access this stuff, regardless of whether they should.
There's a few things you just said. Number one, I love what you did with your son. Congratulations. That's great. Also, UCLA is not an easy school to get into. I know you teach there, but you've informed me that that doesn't mean
Mhm.
anything. My husband went there. Number two, I, that is so important because I have this 14-year-old girl. She's on TikTok all the time. It's really hard to get her off. So we
Off.
are trying to
Yes.
do like it's summer, we're trying to be like, you need to get out of the house. She's actually going to get a job. Like I know she's only 14 and it's kind of like very, very part-time. I need her to babysit. I need her to do all these things. So I love that you brought up like the preventative ways of getting kids, like when we were kids, I've talked about this before. My mom would open the garage to my court and be like, bye, see you later until it was dark. We'd go out in the
Yeah.
court and I was lucky enough to live in a safe area where we could play kick the can. and we could play Ghosts in the
Yeah.
Graveyard. They don't have any of that, right? Do you remember
Ghosts
Ghost in
in
the
the Graveyard.
Graveyard?
They can. All these games are going to be canceled by the way
I
they're
know,
named,
but it was my
right? Yeah,
favorite.
Cowboys and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Aliens. Yeah, Thumbs Up, Seven Up. Yeah, yeah, we did all that.
Um,
Kick the
but my
can,
point
spin the
is,
bottle,
oh,
spin the
spin the bottle.
bottle.
God, I think they still play that, which is scary. But my point is, I think I love that piece of it, but I also appreciate what you said about the brain not being fully developed. So you're the doctor here. Is it 27 for women and older for men? And when, because you can't wait till they're 27 to have a fully formed.
No,
Yeah.
no, like, that's just these are general rules of thumbs,
Okay.
right? Some are gonna develop faster, and again, when people are saying, "What's being developed?" Well, the neurons, the, actual brain tissue, the actual brain cells, the deep connections. Imagine a tree, that's the best way we talk about it. You know, a full-blown tree, all the branches, all the leaves, all the roots, all those connections. Well, when you're 14, that tree is half the size, the branches are all over, the leaves are, sprouting. It looks awkward, right? It's the same thing. A fully formed tree, it takes a while. So that's how we think about what's happening inside the brain. So that's why when you introduce things like trauma or substances or whatever, it changes the directions the branches go, or it kills off certain branches so that they don't develop fully. So I think again, I'm beginning to sense this movement in America where people are recognizing we need to sit up and pay attention to what we're
Mhm.
doing, and that we cannot just blindly equate that we have phones and think it was no different than MTV or TV growing up. So when I was a kid, MTV, my parents were like, "I don't want you watching that stuff. That's going to turn you into a bad person. You're going to be morally, lacking." Right? And they would forbid it. There was also one summer, this is a funny story, is that I loved Days of Our Lives growing up. And during my junior year in high school, I would watch every episode of Days of Our Lives during the summer, Patch, all the whole thing. And then my dad's like, "I do not want you watching this." He's like, "This is garbage. This is poisoning your brain." I said, "Well," and even back then I said, "Dad, what evidence do you have of that? How can you say that? My grades are good. I have friends. I'm healthy. Why?" He said, "I just don't want you doing that. So don't." And I stopped because he said so. Now, there's no science to tell us Days of Our Lives was terrible for a 17-year-old, man child to watch, but he set a firm boundary. And I think that's why I'm telling that story is that, again, there's two things I think. The phone is not Days of Our Lives. The social media experience, the TikTok stuff they're consuming is not Days of Our Lives. And people argue, "Oh, no, it is." I'll say, no, Days of Our Lives, it was a story. It captured your attention. You saw ups and downs, the humanity of it all. You saw the whole perspective of learning to talk to people and all the stories embedded. That's not what we get from these short bursts of videos for TikTok. And that it is a different thing. And I think too often parents have equated the phone as it's no different than television or MTV when we were kids, and it's not. It's different. It's active. It's snippets of information. It's partial information. It's not seeing the full picture. It's not seeing a story from beginning to end. So you remember all those soap operas? It would take months for the
I mean,
story to
you said
evolve,
Days of
right?
Our Lives, and I used to watch One Life to Live with Vicky and her evil twin, and and General Hospital. So that was my summers. That was like our generation. That's what we did. Yeah.
Right, but right, I'm talking
Yeah,
like
months.
months,
Yeah.
weeks
Yeah.
for story to develop. Do you really think what does that do to a young person? It teaches you
Yeah.
patience. It makes you curious. It makes you live with uncertainty, with fear, with anger, with I can't wait. None of that happens with social media. Swipe right, swipe left. Oh, that's interesting. That's not interesting. Bang, 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 bang. There's no, and this is all spitball. This is all opinions. There's no processing of what I'm watching. I'm just reacting. And I'm almost dissociation. And that's kind of like what also happens with slot machines and various forms of gambling, when people are like, how can you sit in front of a slot machine for 8 hours straight? And a lot of the gamblers will tell me, how can you not? And it's just they dissociate, they numb out, they get to a space where all they're looking for is just little bursts of pleasure. That's a very different experience. And then the harder thing, I think, for social media is that fear of missing out. The If I don't log on and I miss the really cool video, either A, I'm going to feel left out, or I'm just going to miss it. And I don't want to miss that. So pile it all together, there's absolutely no doubt. And I think your podcast is spot on by continuing to really get deep into this. How are we impacted by these phones? Because what I don't hear a lot about are a lot of folks, being tethered to their laptops or their desktops, constantly scrolling and doing all that. Sure, they do that, but not to the same degree as the phone. It doesn't disrupt their lives as much as the phone, right? When they're out driving or when they're out, right? Did you talk to me about having that sleepover with the girls? And they were all, no, it was another friend of mine. And she had a sleepover with teenage girls. And she's a physician. And she was like, oh, I was all prepped for them to be loud and staying up to 2, 3 a.m. And she said she was appalled at how quiet the sleepover was. And she went up there and all 10 girls were in the room. All 10 girls were on their phone. And it was dead
That's
quiet. Now that's
upsetting.
a cultural
Yeah.
shock. That's upsetting. Now I don't know if that's happened to you with your
I
daughters and all that,
actually
but
am an example of like the biggest helicopter parent on the planet, and I'm trying to let up, but I don't allow sleepovers. I know too much. I'm gonna start with my 14-year-old. It's too scary for me. But that is an example, like you said, that's terrifying. What some of my happiest memories of being a teenager were playing music, right? A bunch of
yeah,
us in high school having like getting ready for a dance, yelling,
yeah,
dancing. This they
being
are
silly,
their
goofing
brains are
off.
being robbed and deprived of all of this. And then like we're talking about today, like not just the gambling piece of it, but just like, I mean, I do talk a lot about the phones and all the damage, and there's so much research coming out now, but it's that is not okay. I mean, what do you even say to that? Like as a doctor, like what do you say to parents? What do you say to people?
Well, that's where I feel like the work that we're doing in addiction
Mhm.
and mental health is really gravitating more and more to that, to try and understand this environment that we've created with the phone and how it impacts our mental health. And again, I think of all these things like gambling or drugs or alcohol, cannabis. That's just the substance of the activity that gets into the brain. The vessel that delivers it, the syringe, if you will, is the phone. So, and or high speed technology, things like that. So now what I'm emphasizing, and it's interesting, if you were to like come watch me do, an intake or a treatment session, you'll be like, wait a minute, well, when's he getting into the meds? When's he getting into the other good stuff? But my recipe is very simple. Our biological treatments are sleep, physical movement, and healthy nutrition. That's it. People are like, oh my God, give me something sexy. And I'm like, yeah, what's sexy is 6 to 8 hours of sleep a night, 3 to 4 high quality meals that are devoid of highly processed food, physical movement, 45 minutes to 2 hours per day. And people are like, oh, that sounds so boring. But if you do those three things, you regulate your body and your brain in a way that's supposed to be regulated. So that's number one. Number two, I then say to folks who are struggling with the phone, don't try and regulate the phone. Don't try and get rid of it or set certain hours or shut the internet off after 8, 9 p.m. Maybe for super young kids, but we're talking about teenage years and up. I say instead, emphasize the other areas of life adulting that have to be done. Learn to cook a meal, play a music instrument, play a competitive sport, get a job, get to know the neighborhood, be good at something. Be good at mowing the lawn, be good at babysitting, be good at organizing, be good at scrapbooking. And I think what's so hard is when you tell a young person, I want you to do these other things, invariably, of course, they're going to say no because it's not nearly as interesting as stuff on the phone. So that's our job as parents to say, you're not an adult yet. Your brain's not fully formed. I'm not going to tell you what to do with the phone, but I am going to tell you you need to do these other things in life first. It's shocking to me how many young kids, for instance, don't get driver's license. It's shocking to me how many kids don't know how to read a map or don't know how to order in a restaurant
Wait a second.
a
Wait,
meal.
back up. What do you mean people aren't getting driver's license? Like young kids are not? It's
Oh, you haven't heard of this thing? Oh, this is a big
okay.
thing. Well, maybe it's in LA, but we get a lot of kids 16, 17, 18 years old don't have a driver's license and don't want
Wait,
one.
why? Because they
And
want
there's
to
a bunch of
Uber or what? Explain that. I know this is kind of like off subject.
it just never was it just wasn't taught in school, or it was never some helicopter parent saying, "I don't want my son or daughter driving in the streets of LA, it's too dangerous." Or the kid being like, "That's too scary. I don't want to do it because I'm afraid of getting into an accident." There's some work. Jean Tweng, she's written about this. Tweng. Jonathan Haidt,
Yeah.
he's written about
Yeah.
this as well. It's just stuff that I've seen growing up. With some of the parents in LA. But those adult milestones, right? Like having sex at an early age, running around, getting jobs or getting fired from jobs. So you pile it all back together. The phone is supposed to be a tool in our lives. It's supposed to make our lives better. It's not supposed to be our lives. It's not supposed to be everything that we spend our time on. But when you're 12, 11, 12, 13, 14, and you get exposed to that, and you buy biological terms, you are so compelled to keep following those algorithms, not because you want to, but because that's what your brain will react to. Of course, that's what's difficult to fight against. So when I work with parents, we walk through some of this stuff. Then I walk through a lot of the resistance parents have about things like their son or daughter getting a job. I've had a number of parents who are like, well, I don't want Johnny to get a job because I'm afraid he's going to get COVID at the job. Or I don't want Johnny to get a job because I'm afraid he's going to get fired. Or I'm afraid that Johnny is going to meet the wrong kind of people. Just things that made no sense to me. And when you break it down, you say, where's that fear coming from for you as a parent? That's where I think our generation, Generation X, and then the millennial parents, for whatever reason, we have a lot more fear based, in part because, at least in Gen X, we were left almost too
Mhm.
alone, right? And we were never told to talk about anything. Never talk about your feelings, stiff upper lip. If you got hit, don't report it. If you got abused, that's your own fault. I'm totally like whitewashing everything, but that sort of thing led to this kind of parenting style of, oh my gosh, all the bad things that happened to our generation, kids on milk cartons, that
Yeah.
sort of thing. We don't want that for our kids, right? Tylenol, cyanide poisoning. Oh my God, there's threats everywhere, leading to that overcompensation of the helicopter and snowplow parenting. You know what snowplow parenting is? Have you
No,
heard
I
that
hope I'm
one?
not a snowplow.
Where
I'm really trying to let up on the
well,
helicoptering because I will let her get a license and I am letting her get a job. So maybe I'm not that bad. What's a
this the
snowplow parent?
snowplow parent literally does everything for the kid, and just drives, and opens everything up. So they'll fill out the application for a job, they'll do the homework, they may even, actually, take them to all, various places and not let the kid go there. That's the snowplow parent. So
Let me
anyway,
ask you because I
anyway,
know that this episode, I mean, I find this I could talk to you for 3 hours, but the episode is about gambling, but I love that it's kind of evolved into these things because it's so true. I want to know kind of in like closing and if just a few more questions. The, it sounds to me like this gambling addiction is starting younger post COVID. So you're probably seeing a lot more patients than you were prior that are
yeah.
and all of this has to do with phones, but all the things that we've talked about. So, and it has kind of turned because we're both parents. So, a lot of my listeners are parents and they do want to know like preventative measures. But you touched on this piece about nutrition. And, I think physical fitness, all of that stuff's so important. But the nutrition piece, it's so hard now because there is so much like stuff in our foods. Can you go like back up a little bit and like expand on that? So you said sleep, number one. You don't start with medication. or not,
Yeah.
maybe you do, but not in all cases, right? Because every brain, like we talked about, is
Not all
different.
cases. Yeah.
But in general, 6 to 8 hours of
Yeah.
sleep, um, 45 minutes of exercise.
Right.
This is what I do, by the way. And I told you I was diagnosed with complex PTSD. I'm also was diagnosed as a teenager with ADD. If I don't have my exercise every day, like not good for my brain. Like tend to
Right.
go to bad
Right.
places. So, but talk about the nutrition piece because it's really difficult to to like for me. I'm just going to use myself as an example. I cannot get my kids to eat the right foods. Like no matter what I do,
Right.
it's that piece that's so hard. So can you give people some like pointers on that?
Yeah, and it's an important area. Like, so first of all, 99% of physicians, we don't get very good training on food science and nutrition in
Mhm.
medical school. And then probably about a few years ago, we began to realize, oh, we had concepts of food addiction, we have rising rates of obesity. There was neuroscience to show that the same brain regions that are affected by addiction are affected by food. So high calorie, high sweet, it activates, the dopamine, it activates the same regions of the brain. We now have a very interesting medication like Ozempic and those various other ones that can reduce obesity and sugar. So that's very interesting. But practically speaking, again, because the pace of life has accelerated so quickly, and because there's so many easy foods out there that taste so good, it's difficult once you get used to that to switch over to anything else. So, meaning again, if you introduce those early foods early on, the high sugar, high calorie, highly processed chemicals that activate brain regions, of course, it's going to be much harder to eat
Mhm.
broccoli. So, our kids are very picky eaters, and we worried very early on. Oh my God, they're never going to gain weight. They're going to be stuck. Blah blah blah. But our youngest son, both of them, they don't have sweet tooth. They don't really like cakes. They don't like cookies. That's just biologically how they're built. So a healthy food starts with, again, so many people just don't know how to cook. So many people don't take the time to learn basic meal preparation because it's time consuming. It's
Also, you
expensive.
might not be a
It's
very good cook, like, I don't know, maybe myself. My husband's the cook in our family. But, yeah, I mean, it's
but
just
it's a
it's
skill.
more
You know what?
time consuming is yeah.
It's time consuming, but it's still ultimately it's an
Mhm,
investment.
mhm.
And that's part of the thing I think people have gone away to say, well, should I invest an hour and a half, 2 hours in preparing a meal, or can I use that time on my phone or use that time in other quote better ways? And it goes back to like your teenager. Do they teach home economics
No.
anymore? So when we were in junior high, we had home
Mhm.
economics, right? And I remember, it was so sexist. It was like all the guys did shop and all the girls did home ec. But there was always that one or two guys that did home ec, and and I realized we all got jealous because he got to hang out with the girls and he learned how to make a meal. But the point being is that's something I think a lot of us in mental health don't do enough, where we actually sit down and talk about, well, what are the barriers to you preparing 2 or 3 meals a day? What are the barriers of avoiding fast food? What are the barriers of door dashing, high calorie, stuff? What's preventing you from putting in a Mediterranean diet, plant based diet, foods that we know are brain superfoods, right? The beans, the antioxidant, the healthy fish, the healthy meats, the colored vegetables that we know give you the sustenance and the foundational blocks that make your neurotransmitters, right? Think of all the drugs that are out there: alcohol, cannabis, opioids, cocaine. These are just plants. They're all plants, right? They're all just different versions of food in some way, shape, or the other. So when you begin to think of it that way, that's why food is a drug. That's why food is also medicine. So there's been plenty of research now showing that certain types of diets, like the Mediterranean diet or
Plant-based.
the Atkins diet,
Oh, Atkins di I
you
haven't
know,
heard I heard Atkins was bad.
yeah,
Yeah.
ketogenic diet, things
Okay.
like that. Um, have been associated with improvement for folks with depression or anxiety or just well-being, preventing dementia and things like that. So it makes sense that food and the right kind of diet would also have an impact on addictive disorders, impulse control issues, or other things that people are struggling with. I've had so many patients who stop the substance, right? And then they pick up food as the next addiction. And I always remember I had a young woman years ago who said, yeah, I've been drunk on chocolate. And she said it so simply, not the chocolate with alcohol, but just chocolate. And this was probably 20 years ago. And that taught me, you know what? We have to be paying attention to it. And we don't. And you go back to, again, the relationship with the phone. And that's the thing where having videos to show you how to cook, having those videos of recipes, that's incredible. That's where using the power of social media and the phone for us to learn how to saute. How do I make a carbonara? I don't know the first thing, but if I saw a video how to do it, that's the
I
value.
think I
The
think
problem, yeah,
it's truly fascinating and all pieces together and make sense. It's just you have to like put the work into it, and that's the piece of it that we are as a culture, we just want a quick fix for everything like we've talked about and it's just not happening. For the sake of time, I just have one question and then I'll let you be free of talking to me anymore.
thank you.
So you brought up like Ozempic and all of that stuff, and I'm very open with it. I've tried it. I've not Ozempic, but like Wegovy, Zepbound. I've been on and off it for like a year, like a lot of people have, like a lot of women in particular that are trying to lose that last 20 pounds, whatever it is. But there's also a lot of research now that it can help with addiction. So
Right.
alcoholism, are you seeing that with the gambling piece as well?
Yeah, we were starting to. I mean, it's still very, very
Mhm.
early on, right? We don't have a lot of controlled clinical trials, and all we hear are just kind of case reports and snippets from the field. And various patients of mine tell me that, yeah, it's a little easier to control my urges to drinking or shopping, or I don't just have the desire to go hard, on a addictive like behavior. But we cannot say with certainty yet. I, we'll see what happens. And, we definitely need more treatment options for gambling disorder and addictions in general. The science and neuroscience behind this is emerging, but it does make some intuitive sense. Working on areas of satiety and self control and reward and how you experience reward. So I'm excited about that. We're also excited about psilocybin and transcranial and magnetic stimulation. We're also excited about
Ooh,
other
I just
options.
did
But
an
at the
episode
end of
about
the
TMS recently. Yeah, I find it
yeah,
fascinating. Yeah.
fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. So, and I'll end with this. If anyone who wants to know more about gambling, take a look at our website, UCLAGamblingProgram.org. I'd love to come back, talk to you more about other things. If you are struggling with a gambling issue or you're concerned or you're worried about your loved one, the first step is getting professional help. That's by calling 1-800-GAMBLER. 1-800-GAMBLER is a helpline that works pretty much throughout every state in America that gets you patched into gambling treatment specialists and help. There's a lot of things out there, and it's always better to reach out sooner rather
And
than later.
there's always hope, right? I mean, that's like the great thing
There's
about life. There's always hope. Dr. Fong, I love talking to you. I'm so grateful to Denise for introducing us. And in closing, keep going. You matter. Your story matters. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
Judging Meghan with Meghan Judge.